On November 22nd, 3I Atlas quietly revealed traces of a strange form of life carrying gel codes and unusual shapes, something NASA has so far subtly avoided naming directly. From bands of optical infrared and radio data, people have gradually pieced together the picture of a microscopic ice biosphere hidden, deep inside, peculiar organic gels, strange pigments, isotope ratios and light polarization all evoke the image of an ancient resilient network of life that seems to store information far beyond the usual template of an ordinary comet. From there, 3 lines of speculation gently separate out 3I Atlas may be a drifting seed of life in the galaxy, a biological probe engineered by another civilization, or a mobile chemical library recording the environmental history of multiple stellar systems. While research teams quietly debate beneath layers of careful wording, NASA continues to lower its tone delay and soften every anomaly, insisting on the label of a normal comet, in sharp contrast with independent observations that show complex behavior difficult to force into any standard model. And so, 3I Atlas becomes at once a rare natural laboratory passing through our era and a silent mirror exposing the fear and limits of science when faced with things that lie beyond its familiar comfort zone. Right after this, we will explore how the shape and biological structure of 3I Atlas have gone far beyond NASA's ability to keep them under control. In a 3-dimensional simulation reconstructed from the data, the image that appeared was clear enough to silence the entire lab inside the ultra-thin channels of liquid water within 3I Atlas. That hypothetical life looked like fine veils of mist, semi-transparent, giving off a very faint jade glow, deepening to green in places, clinging along the ice walls like bioluminescent moss. At higher magnification, each veil broke apart into thinner filaments, long and sinuous like filamentous bacteria chains of tiny beads linked together, each bead a cell in the imagination faintly iridescent as if coated in an extremely thin, oily membrane. The colour was not as vivid as Earth's marine organisms, but a soft sheen shifting toward blue in colder regions and yellow-green in warmer pockets of water, like an aurora shrunk down into a single droplet. All of it was only a model built from the data, yet it arose from very concrete numbers: light polarization, isotope ratios, spectral variability. Before that imagined image existed, the team led by Sarah Seeger and Ayumi Takahashi had already recorded that the light reflected from the icy dust around 3 Atlas carried a distinct circular polarization component, consistently favouring one-handed direction, exactly the kind of pattern that on Earth is only seen when light passes through ensembles of chiral biological molecules such as amino acids or sugars. In parallel, at Harvard Smithsonian, Avi Loeb and Maria Gonzalez were analysing the infrared spectra of organic molecules outgassing from the comet, extracting the C12, C13 and N14, N15 ratios, and comparing them with cometary data from within the solar system. The distribution curve for 3I Atlas did not follow the usual primordial ice pattern, but instead resembled more closely terrestrial sediments that have been chewed over many times by microbial life. Some compounds depleted in carbon-13, others enriched in nitrogen-15 in a highly ordered way. When every purely physical model of outgassing, irradiation and stratification failed to reproduce that pattern, they were forced to introduce the assumption of a closed material recycling loop, something on Earth firmly associated with the presence of a biosphere. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the Meerkat team, advised by Jill Tarter, found that even after subtracting the standard comet model, certain molecular lines in the radio spectrum still oscillated periodically, matching the rotation period of 3I Atlas, and peaking whenever the core region in thermal models was warmest and facing the sun, as if that microscopic glowing moss became just a little more active each time its water channels were gently heated. When the 3 teams laid their data side by side and projected the combined simulation, the icy core with its liquid channels mapped in colour, the chiral polarization rendered as brightness, the isotope-rich biological zones washed in green, they finally obtained that imagined image of the organism, pale jade threads clinging to the ice walls, fading slowly as 3 Atlas moved away from the sun's light. No one dared claim it was a real photograph. No one declared we have imaged an interstellar organism, but they all understood to simulate a structure with both shape and colour, like that they had had to rely on data that until then could only really be explained by one very difficult phrase: the signature of a microscopic living system existing within the heart of the comet 3I Atlas. Beneath the cold grey ice of 3I Atlas, what scientists derived from models and data no longer resembled a simple comet, but a tiny enclosed world, silence sealed yet far from dead. According to thermal and structural models, hundreds of meters down lies a relatively stable ice rock core. When 3 Atlas wanders through the dark between stars, this core freezes solid like diamond, but each time it sweeps near a star, the outer layers warm just enough for the ice lattice to fracture into countless ultra-thin channels of liquid water. These channels are so small that the human mind struggles to picture them, some only a few tens of nanometers wide, others a few micrometers, winding around grains of silicate dust salts and CO2 ice, forming a dim, damp labyrinth like a compressed vascular system trapped inside a single stone. Within these channels, chemical modelling suggests the existence of organic structures that are not quite cells, yet no longer just inert mixtures. Each living unit is a tiny molecular gel where carbon polymers, metal ions and information-bearing fragments are held in a semi-solid ice-water matrix. Outside it, the shell is not a lipid membrane like Earth's organisms, but multiple layers of amorphous ice mixed with salts, capable of self-healing when cracked. Simulations show that when temperatures drop to nearly 200 descend, the entire structure almost completely freezes every reaction, slowing to the point of near standstill, yet the internal network of bonds maintains its order like frozen memory. When cosmic radiation shatters the outer shell, a brief warm season is enough for the inner polymers to flow, rearrange and seal the fractures as if they were designed to be battered to sleep and to wake again and again over hundreds of millions of years. Billions of such units cling to channel walls and dust grains linking to one another through the slow seep of ions and molecules, forming an interconnected network that at the scale of the whole core looks more like a single superorganism than a collection of isolated individuals. What chills the scientists most is the colour and order of these structures. When projected back in simulation, in old regions where material has been recycled many times, the light spectra reveal accumulations of strange organic pigments that strongly absorb ultraviolet and then emit faintly in the blue. In other regions, they absorb blue and emit a yellow-green glow. As starlight passes through the maze of channels, it is very slightly tinted by these pigments, producing preferred bands at certain wavelengths. If each type of pigment is treated as a letter, then the pattern of pigment distribution in each cluster of channels resembles repeated phrases complex enough to be compressible, structured enough that it cannot simply be dismissed as noise. Information theorists ran the numbers and showed that the probability of a purely chemical, mindless system producing such highly compressible arrangements is almost zero on short time scales, unless it has somehow learned to encode something, perhaps a history of environmental conditions, perhaps the very blueprint of the network itself. In terms of energy sources, this living system has no sunlit oceans or oxygen-rich atmosphere to squander. It survives on things that few would previously have considered sufficient: a tiny trickle of radiogenic heat from rocky dust, occasional weak bursts of ultraviolet light, whenever 3I Atlas nears a star, and chemical gradients created by the freeze-thaw cycle of the ice. Each time the ice melts slightly and refreezes salts, and organic molecules are squeezed, forming alternating zones of concentrated and dilute. The molecular gel network exploits those differences like a tiny battery, driving ions across its ice shell and storing just enough potential energy to maintain its structure. The metabolic cycle proceeds so slowly that a single full loop may take decades, but that very slowness ensures the system never burns through its fragile reserves in one reckless flare of activity. When dynamicists traced back the isotopic and mineral composition, they realized 3I Atlas was likely born in the protoplanetary disk of another star rich in ultraviolet radiation, then thrown out by a collision and left to drift through interstellar space, meaning the frozen biosphere inside it is older than the solar system, carrying chemical fingerprints not of just one, but possibly many stars it has passed by. Strikingly, the complexity of the organic structures in 3 Atlas seems to stop at the threshold of a microscopic network optimized for endurance. It does not advance to tissues, organs, or large bodies, as if somewhere in its evolutionary history or during some act of redesign, someone or something imposed a limit intelligent enough to store and transmit information durable enough to cross a galaxy, but never so bulky that it self-destructs. In that vision, life inside 3I Atlas is no longer a random accident, but a form of existence tuned for a single purpose, curling into ice, travelling from star to star, carrying the chemical story of an entire region of the galaxy, and revealing only a few thin mist-like threads of light to any civilization sensitive enough to notice. As the picture of an ice biosphere inside 3i Atlas gradually emerged from the data, the question was no longer whether life existed there but why it appeared in that place, and what kind of cosmic story it belonged to. In closed-door discussions, scientists began to split into three major lines of interpretation. One view saw 3i Atlas as a stray seed of the galaxy. In some ancient stellar system, life had arisen in a subsurface ocean or on a rocky planet, and a colossal impact had hurled water, mud and organisms into the system's cometary disk. Over time, life-rich material clung to blocks of ice was sealed inside their cores, flung out of the parent system, and left to drift between stars. In that picture, 3i Atlas is just one of countless such dormant test tubes happening to pass through the solar system at the very moment humanity becomes just sensitive enough to pick up its chiral isotopic and slow metabolic traces. The disturbing part is not the comet itself, but the possibility that the galaxy has long been full of such compressed biospheres. A second line pushes the story further. The living network in 3i Atlas's core is not a random accident, but the result of some form of biological engineering. In the star suggested by radio data and radiation signatures, there may once have been a civilization that learned how to compress life into its bare minimum radiation. Tolerant molecular gels that can survive on weak gradients and encode information in pigments and isotopes, then packaged them into cometary cores, tuned them to remain stable for billions of years, and launched them as biological probes. In that view, every time 3i Atlas sweeps near a new star, the ice biosphere inside both interacts with the environment and records its response into its own structure, while simultaneously sending back subtle feedback through spectra light and tiny variations that the distant owners know how to decode. The solar system in that case is just one data point in a cosmic experiment, so long it dwarfs human history, and our interception of those scraps of information is essentially reading someone else's lab notebook without permission. A third line focuses on the strange information storage capacity suggested by the models, treating the entire ice biosphere as a kind of mobile chemical library. Each water channel, each pigment cluster, each isotopic pattern is a character in a distributed memory architecture that fills the core. At that scale, 3i Atlas resembles a living hard drive more than an ecosystem. If the information theoretic analyses are correct, fully decoding its network of gels, pigments and gradients would be like reading a book of environmental history it has passed through from the star where it was born to every close encounter with other stars with the solar system as only a thin chapter. None of these interpretations appears in any official press release. To the outside world, one only hears the familiar phrases about an interstellar comet, rich in water and organics. In the drafts sent up, the chain words like biosignature, biosphere and biological design are crossed out one by one and replaced with interesting organic patterns and complex chemistry. Graphs showing pigment encoding gel networks and links to a distant star are pushed down into internal appendices never included in public data packages. Press conferences are staged carefully, allowing only a few reassuring sound bites, while the most dangerous parts, the possibility that 3i Atlas is a seed, a probe or a living archive created by an alien intelligence, are kept inside windowless rooms and servers no one outside the inner circle can touch. Yet among those who have seen the raw data, 3i Atlas has long since ceased to be an anonymous lump of ice and become an unanswered question that is being forced into silence. Did we just stumble upon a lonely biosphere? Or did we brush against one link in a vast experimental and mnemonic network, the universe set in motion before Earth ever formed? And why did NASA decide this is something the world is not yet allowed to know? The space agency built the entire briefing around a single steady message about 3i Atlas. Again and again, the scientist repeated that 3i Atlas was just a comet, emphasizing normal behavior and familiar comet physics. NASA kept stressing that the data on 3i Atlas was still being processed, not yet calibrated, not ready to be fully shared. Every mention of unfinished data became one more reason the public could not yet see 3i Atlas directly. Whenever unusual chemistry, strange dust behavior or unexpected features came up, the researchers softened their wording and quickly moved away from those anomalies of 3i Atlas. Cautious phrases about complexity and instrument limits were used to lower expectations around what 3i Atlas might reveal. Step by step, the scientific team erected a barrier of reasonable-sounding explanations between the public and the direct evidence about 3i Atlas. The result was that 3i Atlas looked more like a predetermined conclusion than an open investigation. Instead of inviting people to explore what the instruments had actually recorded, the narrators of the story steered the audience toward how they were supposed to think about 3 Atlas. Within that managed silence, the questions surrounding 3 Atlas were not answered, only postponed, left hanging just outside whatever the space agency chose to show the public. The scientific teams did not completely ignore the strange signals hidden in the data on 3 Atlas. They acknowledged a few anomalous hints from Atlas, and then quickly moved past them, wrapping each detail in cautious, reassuring language. One key point lay in the chemical composition of 3 Atlas. NASA only mentioned in passing that Atlas seemed to show an unusually high ratio of carbon dioxide compared with many known comets. In a different context, such an out-of-family composition in 3 Atlas might have become a major headline, but here it was treated as a footnote. Researchers also referred to an excess of nickel relative to iron in the material associated with 3I Atlas. If confirmed, that ratio could suggest a formation history or thermal processing environment for Atlas that is very different from typical comets in the solar system. Yet the potential implications for the origin story of 3 Atlas were not explored. The detail was named and then gently set aside. Another signal involved the polarization of dust around 3 Atlas. Polarization can carry information about grain size, structure, and alignment in the coma surrounding Atlas. Scientists described this polarization pattern as unexpected, but did not present full plots or spectra that would let the public see how far 3I Atlas might sit from standard models. When the idea appeared that the home system of 3I Atlas might have formed before the Sun itself, that information was also introduced almost casually. Such an age estimate would mean Atlas has wandered through interstellar space for billions of years, carrying traces of an era that predates our star. For any interstellar object, and especially for 3 Atlas, that is an extraordinary possibility, yet the presenting team did not pause long enough to discuss what it might mean. Each time a property of 3 Atlas sounded unusual, the scientists immediately reached for familiar cushions. Instrument limits, unfavourable viewing angles, scattered light, and the need for further calibration were cited as reasons not to present detailed data on Atlas at this stage. Again and again, the message was that spectra maps and high-resolution products related to 3I Atlas would be released later, after more rounds of internal checks. Taken one by one, these caveats about 3I Atlas sounded very careful, and entirely in line with scientific practice. Taken together, they formed a pattern in which the most intriguing signals from Atlas were acknowledged, softened, and then allowed to drift away from the centre of attention. Instead of expanding on why those anomalies might matter, the scientists emphasised why it was safer not to dig into them deeply yet. The result was a quiet narrowing of the story surrounding 3I Atlas. On paper, the research community had admitted that Atlas shows unusual chemistry, strange dust behaviour, and a potentially ancient origin. In practice, the way those signals were handled made 3 Atlas feel like an invitation to explore that had been left hanging a set of loose threads that should for now be gently set aside. Labelling 3 Atlas as a normal comet carries a clearly defensive tone. The scientists seem afraid of two things at once: public overinterpretation, and the quiet admission that 3 Atlas does not really fit the models they rely on. In the familiar theoretical framework, comets are dusty snowballs that behave nicely, easy to plot on graphs and drop into textbooks. But 3 Atlas comes with a strange CO2 ratio, hints of excess nickel, and a dust polarization pattern that is not truly standard. Each detail can be explained on its own, but taken together they suggest the uncomfortable possibility that Atlas is standing outside the safe zone of the model. So the safest option is to keep speaking about 3 Atlas as an ordinary comet until the evidence forces the story to change. A model mismatch is not just a technical glitch, it can shake an entire system of assumptions, fuel skewed debates, and expose the gap between knowing and being able to prove. The language around 3 Atlas is therefore sanded smooth still within expectations not inconsistent with a comet, no evidence of anything too exotic. Instead of admitting that Atlas might be telling them something new, people quietly treat 3 Atlas as just a more complicated version of something already familiar. Behind that lies a very human fear. No one wants to overstate what 3 Atlas means and then walk it back, and no one wants their words cut into a few seconds of aliens or secret engines. By keeping 3 Atlas in the normal comet box for as long as possible, the experts reduce the risk of being misunderstood, but they also shrink the space for open curiosity. Whether 3 Atlas later proves ordinary or truly strange, it has already forced a change in how people talk about it. Data is delayed, softened, reframed to fit older models. That gap in turn opens a path for independent observers and outside voices to step in and follow the parts of the story that were left between the lines. When the announcement came that a dedicated broadcast would focus on 3 Atlas, it did not sound like the way scientists usually talk about a simple passing comet. The timing, the coordination, and the language around Atlas hinted that the data waiting in the background might be anything but routine. In official notes and quiet previews, the agency described how multiple spacecraft had been steered or repurposed to catch glimpses of 3I Atlas. Orbiters near Mars observatories around Earth and deep space probes were all folded into a patchwork observing campaign that treated Atlas more like a rare laboratory experiment than a casual flyby. Instead of relying on a single telescope, the teams collected light from 3 Atlas, across different wavelengths and from different angles, building a layered view of Atlas as it slipped through the inner system. That kind of distributed multi-mission attention is usually reserved for targets expected to teach something new, and 3 Atlas quietly moved into that category without ever being described as such directly. The early descriptions emphasized that 3 Atlas was bright enough and close enough at just the right geometry for spectroscopy imaging and time series measurements that might resolve the fine structure of Atlas. The more the teams talked about signal-to-noise exposure strategies and coordinated schedules, the clearer it became that they saw 3I Atlas as an opportunity that would not come again in the same way. When the first processed frames were summarized, the shape of 3I Atlas began to depart from the mental picture many people carry of a comet. Instead of a single fuzzy smudge, Atlas appeared as a compact luminous region wrapped in a structured envelope with gradients and edges that did not fully match textbook sketches. Color composites suggested subtle variations across the glow surrounding 3 Atlas, hinting at zones where the material might be denser, more reflective or chemically distinct. Even in cautious language, the teams admitted that Atlas seemed to present a more organized brightness pattern than they would typically expect from a tumbling outgassing fragment of ice and dust. The public did not see raw frames, but they heard that 3 Atlas had been captured at resolutions high enough to separate its central light from the broader coma. Within those carefully described contours, Atlas seemed less like a formless streak and more like a compact object wrapped in a dynamic halo, a geometry that invited closer scrutiny. Each time someone summarized the observing plan, it became obvious that 3 Atlas had pulled instruments into configurations at the edge of their design. Teams stretched exposure times, adjusted pointing, and squeezed Atlas into windows between primary mission tasks, all to catch a little more structure and a little more detail. On paper, this was still an interstellar comet drifting through nothing more. In practice, the scale and precision of the campaign signaled that 3 Atlas was being treated as a rare probe of conditions beyond the solar system, a natural experiment that would not repeat. The contrast between the modest words and the ambitious observing strategy left a quiet tension in the air around 3 Atlas. Officially, everything about Atlas could still be framed as within expectations, yet the extraordinary effort to map its light and outline its shape suggested that the data might eventually tell a richer story than the labels implied. The first real shift in how people talked about 3 Atlas came when Loeb drew attention to a set of unusually sharp images. In those frames, Atlas no longer looked like a simple blur. 3I Atlas showed a bright core sitting inside a spray of structured features that did not behave like a single uniform tail. Loeb highlighted jets that seemed to fire in several directions at once, like thin beams of material radiating from different regions around 3 Atlas. Instead of one soft fan of gas and dust trailing neatly away from the sun, Atlas appeared to carry multiple narrow outflows that curved and intersected in ways that suggested a more complex pattern of activity. In Loeb's reading, these images of 3 Atlas hinted at dynamics that might be difficult to fold into standard comet models. If the jets of Atlas really were pointing in several directions and changing over short times, then the spin state and internal structure of 3 Atlas could be far from the slow, stable rotation often assumed for icy fragments. At the same time, Loeb was careful not to claim that 3 Atlas was anything other than a natural object. He framed Atlas as a test of how far existing theories could stretch, asking whether outgassing surface fractures and asymmetric heating were enough to generate the kind of organized multi-directional flows seen around 3I Atlas. That combination of restraint and curiosity made Loeb's perspective stand out. 3I Atlas became, in his view, a kind of natural laboratory. If the dynamics of Atlas could be explained within known physics, the models would be strengthened. If not, 3 Atlas might force a revision of how scientists think about interstellar debris. In this way, the strange motion and structured jets of 3I Atlas were not treated as proof of anything exotic. They were treated as a challenge, an open invitation from Atlas to push beyond comfortable assumptions and follow the data wherever 3I Atlas was quietly pointing. When SETI chose to highlight the upcoming announcement, 3 Atlas quietly moved into a different category. The Institute does not draw attention to every passing object, and its decision to point followers toward a broadcast about Atlas suggested that the data could matter for questions far beyond one comet-shaped visitor. In public posts, SETI simply relayed the schedule and emphasized that multiple spacecraft and telescopes had been used to observe 3I Atlas. There were no bold claims, no speculation about signals, just a calm reminder that Atlas would soon be the focus of a coordinated scientific update. That restraint made the gesture more striking by amplifying the event without commentary. SETI framed 3 Atlas as an object worth listening to carefully. Outside institutional channels, the community of independent observers was already building its own record of 3 Atlas. Amateur astronomers pointed modest telescopes at Atlas night after night, stacking exposures, measuring brightness, and watching the subtle ways the glow of 3 Atlas shifted against the stars. Their images, though less polished than space-based products, offered something the official pipeline could not, an almost continuous unfiltered timeline of Atlas as seen from Earth. In online forums and shared documents, these observers compared notes on how 3I Atlas brightened, how the coma of Atlas stretched or tilted, and how small features appeared or vanished between sessions. Some saw variations that seemed to support the idea of complex jets and rapid changes in the orientation of 3I Atlas. Others argued that atmospheric seeing, processing choices and noise could mimic structure that was not really there. The tension between these perspectives turned 3I Atlas into a live experiment in how models are tested. On one side, professional teams worked with carefully calibrated data, waiting until they were confident before announcing what Atlas was doing. On the other, community observers shared their raw impressions in real time, letting patterns around 3 Atlas emerge in public even before they could be fully explained. For theorists, this mix of official and grassroots observations offered a rare chance to stress test physical models. If standard comet physics could reproduce the behavior of 3 Atlas across both precise spacecraft data and noisy ground-based images, then the underlying equations would be strengthened. If, however, the same model could not account for the full range of features attributed to 3I Atlas, something in the assumptions would have to give. In that sense, 3I Atlas became more than an isolated anomaly. Atlas turned into a benchmark, a moving target against which theories of outgassing rotation, internal structure, and interstellar weathering could be measured. Each new frame and light curve involving 3 Atlas gave modelers another constraint, another chance to ask whether their simulations were keeping up with reality. SETI's quiet signal boost combined with the persistence of independent observers ensured that 3 Atlas would not slip past unnoticed. Even if the official conclusion eventually places Atlas comfortably within the family of comets, the process of checking that claim will have exercised the limits of current physics. And if 3 at last refuses to fit cleanly, the discrepancy will not be easy to hide. Too many eyes have already followed Atlas across the sky, turning this interstellar visitor into a shared test of how honestly science can confront its own models. The first clear portrait of 3 Atlas arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, carefully processed image. In that single frame, Atlas looked calm, almost graceful, suspended against a dark field of scattered stars. A small observatory had gathered many long exposures and stacked them until the noise faded and the true outline of 3 Atlas emerged. The result was a clean version of Atlas stripped of atmospheric flicker and tracking errors, leaving behind a steady glow that felt almost unbothered by motion. At the center of the frame, 3 Atlas appeared as a compact bright core wrapped in a smooth rounded halo. The transition from the core of Atlas to the surrounding coma was gentle, with no violent spikes, no jagged edges, just a soft gradient fading into the night. Around that halo, the tail of 3 Atlas stretched out in a single well-behaved direction. The tail of Atlas did not twist or fragment in this view. It pulled away like a quiet brushstroke aligned in a way that matched what simple comet physics would suggest. In many people's minds, comets are messy, wild objects shedding gas in chaotic plumes, and 3 Atlas had been described that way in some discussions. Yet in this processed reality, Atlas seemed anything but chaotic. presenting a shape that would not look out of place in a textbook diagram. The brightness profile of 3 Atlas when measured across the image supported that impression of order. The light from Atlas fell off smoothly with distance from the core like a curve drawn by hand, and then gently perfected by a patient observer. This clean image reality did not deny that 3 Atlas was active. The tail and coma around Atlas was still there, still extended, still glowing from the sun's energy. But the character of that activity in this view of 3 Atlas felt controlled rather than explosive. For many viewers, this was the first time 3 Atlas felt truly real, more than a number on a page or a rumour in a headline. The photograph gave Atlas a body, a posture, a way of existing in space that could be looked at slowly, even peacefully. In the larger story, this stable portrait of 3 Atlas became one half of a quiet paradox. Other observations would later hint at motion asymmetry and subtle shifts, but the clean frame of Atlas anchored the imagination in something steady. From that anchor, the mind could safely drift, comparing this calm, organised version of 3 to Atlas with the more restless realities that other eyes and other instruments would soon reveal. When people looked at the clean portrait of 3 Atlas, the message seemed simple. 3 Atlas appeared stable, composed, like a well-behaved visitor that had settled into a predictable role. Yet away from that single processed frame, observers who watched 3 Atlas night after night began to notice a second layer of reality. In their logs and stacked images, Atlas did not always hold the same posture in the sky. Some amateurs reported that the coma of 3 Atlas looked slightly off-centre from one session to the next. On some nights, the glow around Atlas seemed to lean a little more in one direction. On others, the light appeared to shift as if 3 Atlas were turning its face by a small quiet angle. Simple effects can mimic these changes, and many observers knew that. Atmospheric turbulence tracking errors and processing choices can all push a faint object like 3 Atlas around on the screen. But when multiple setups in different places hinted at similar shifts, the idea of hidden dynamics around Atlas became harder to dismiss. Brightness variations added another layer to the puzzle. Light curves built from repeated exposures suggested that 3 Atlas did not shine with a perfectly steady output. Across hours or days, the recorded flux from Atlas rose and dipped in gentle, irregular steps like a breathing pattern that never quite locked into a single rhythm. There are natural explanations for this kind of behaviour in 3 Atlas. As Atlas rotates, active regions on the surface can turn toward or away from the sun, changing how much gas and dust 3 Atlas releases at any moment. Dust moving through the coma can also clump or disperse, modulating how light scatters around Atlas. Still, the sense remained that the clean snapshot had frozen only one face of 3 Atlas, while the rest of the story was playing out in time. Some observers focused on the tail of 3 Atlas, searching for short-lived structures. On certain nights, faint knots and streaks seemed to appear along the tail of Atlas, then smear out or vanish by the next run. These features were subtle and easy to lose in noise, but repeated mentions suggested that 3 Atlas might be responding to sunlight and internal stresses in ways that shift on human timescales. Professional teams working with more sensitive instruments hinted at similar complexity when they spoke about 3 Atlas. Without showing every frame, they referenced time-resolved data spin solutions and changing outflow patterns connected to Atlas. The language remained cautious, but the implication was that 3 Atlas carried a moving architecture of gas and dust that a single clean portrait could never capture. In this way, 2 layers of observation formed around 3 Atlas. One layer consisted of carefully stacked images and processed products that presented Atlas as a calm textbook object. The other layer came from continuous monitoring, imperfect but honest, about the flicker and shift that seemed to follow 3 Atlas through the sky. The tension between these layers did not mean that anyone was wrong about 3 Atlas. Instead, it highlighted the gap between what a still image can say and what a time series can reveal. 3 Atlas in a single photograph could look serene, symmetric, and comfortably familiar. 3 Atlas over many nights began to look like a system in motion with forces and feedbacks that were only partly mapped. For the people who followed 3 Atlas closely, this dual reality changed the emotional tone of the story. The clean frame offered reassurance, a stable anchor for the imagination whenever Atlas felt too strange. The living record of shifts and variations invited curiosity, nudging viewers to accept that 3 Atlas might always be doing a little more than what showed up in any one picture. Together, these 2 ways of seeing forced a more mature kind of attention on 3 Atlas. To understand Atlas, one had to hold both images in mind at once: the tidy portrait and the restless sequence, the fixed shape and the evolving flow. In that overlapping space, 3 Atlas stopped being just a static object and became more like a slow, quiet process unfolding in real time as it crossed the inner solar system and slipped back toward the dark. From a distance, 3 Atlas looks like the kind of object that should eventually give up all its secrets. Telescopes can watch Atlas from multiple worlds, spacecraft can sweep past on silent arcs, and algorithms can comb through every photon that 3 Atlas reflects or emits. Yet as the data slowly accumulates, 3 Atlas continues to feel strangely unfinished. For every parameter pinned down, another remains blurred, as if Atlas were always one step beyond the current resolution. Orbit calculations can tell us where 3 Atlas came from in a broad statistical sense. The trajectory of Atlas marks it as interstellar a visitor that does not belong to the Sun's family, and will not stay long enough to become familiar. Even so, the exact birthplace of 3 Atlas remains hypothetical, a region on a map that Atlas left behind billions of years ago. Spectra can outline what 3 Atlas is made of, but the lines do not fully settle into place. Unusual carbon dioxide levels, suggestive nickel-to-iron ratios, and odd dust polarization hint that Atlas carries a history slightly out of step with standard comet narratives. Each new measurement refines the profile of 3 Atlas, yet the object still refuses to collapse into a single simple category. Future images from orbiters near Mars may sharpen the visible outline of 3 Atlas. High-resolution cameras could catch the detailed shape of Atlas's coma. The fine texture of the tail even shifts in jets as 3 Atlas rotates. But those images, when they arrive, will still be snapshots in a moving story, brief windows into a process Atlas has been undergoing long before Earth ever knew its name. In practical terms, 3 Atlas will pass through a band of uncertainty and then slip away. The close approach geometry gives only a limited interval during which Atlas is bright enough, close enough, and well placed enough for serious study. Once 3 Atlas recedes, the data stream will thin, and modelers will be left with whatever clues they managed to collect while Atlas was near. This built-in limitation changes the tone of inquiry. Scientists cannot wait indefinitely for more perfect observations of 3 Atlas. They must draw inferences from partial, noisy, and sometimes contradictory pieces. 3 Atlas becomes less like a puzzle with a guaranteed solution, and more like a conversation cut off mid-sentence. Emotionally, there is something fitting about that. 3 Atlas did not arrive for us, and Atlas will not stay to satisfy our curiosity. The object is carrying memories of a system we may never see, and 3 Atlas is under no obligation to make those memories fully readable. For observers on Earth, this realization creates a quiet humility. 3 Atlas crosses our sky for a brief moment in its unimaginably long journey, offering just enough information to challenge assumptions without closing every gap. In that sense, Atlas mirrors, the way science often works, progress made at the edges with mysteries that recede as quickly as they are named. When the last good images are taken and the final spectra are logged, 3 Atlas will already be on its way back into the dark. Analyses will continue for years, and 3 Atlas will live on in plot simulations and papers that try to reconstruct what happened during this encounter. But the living presence of Atlas, the sense of a moving, changing body in the sky, will fade, replaced by archive files and memory. What remains is a kind of shared awareness. For a short season, telescopes across the solar system turned toward 3 Atlas, and people on one small world followed Atlas with their eyes and thoughts. 3. Atlas will keep most of its secrets, yet its passage through this narrow band of uncertainty has already done its quiet work, nudging our models, stretching our imagination, and reminding us how much of the universe still moves just beyond what we can fully see. By now, the outline of 3 Atlas has come into focus even as the core of the story stays just out of reach. Across briefings, images, and debates, 3 Atlas has been pulled through labels, tested against models, and pressed into metaphors that never quite contain it. On the surface, 3 Atlas can still be described as a comet-shaped visitor from outside the solar system. That description is not wrong, but it is smaller than the path Atlas has cut through our instruments and assumptions. Chemistry that leans away from the norm dust behavior that complicates simple diagrams, and a dual visual reality, clean portraits versus restless time series, have all pushed 3 Atlas to the edge of what feels familiar. In response, the language around 3 Atlas has grown careful, even defensive. Experts smooth the rough edges, delay data, and work to keep Atlas inside the safest possible frame for as long as they can. At the same time, independent observers and curious listeners have followed 3 Atlas more freely willing to sit with ambiguity while the object moves on. That tension has turned 3 Atlas into something more than a target. Atlas has become a mirror reflecting how science behaves when confronted with a rare, limited, and slightly disobedient source of information. 3 Atlas shows how knowledge advances at the boundary between what can be measured cleanly and what can only be inferred from partial shifting traces. Soon enough, 3 Atlas will be gone from easy view, reduced to archived files, cited plots, and a few carefully worded conclusions. But the passage of Atlas through this brief window will remain as a quiet pressure on our models and on our imagination. Somewhere far beyond the reach of our telescopes, 3. Atlas will continue on its way, carrying whatever history it has always carried. Down here, long after Atlas fades from the sky, the questions it raised will still be moving slowly through the dark corners of what we think we understand.